And really the purpose of this session is for me to share some of the work that I've done. In my role, I'm the Director of Curriculum Instructional Services for Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES. I've spent 10 years basically with the organization. Prior to that, I was a middle school science teacher for a decade. And the last 10 years have been spent really thinking about what makes professional learning, what makes adult learning really work. And so what I'm going to share with you today is some of those experiences, some of the research I've done, some of the work done by others, and how I've come to kind of think about putting it all together. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. And what I'll also do, I'll share the details of this presentation with you a little bit later in the chat box as well. And what we're going to do over the course of our time together this afternoon is go through what I see as the three pillars of professional learning, what I call planning for professional learning, providing it, actually facilitating, and then following up afterwards, and how this structure has helped me to think more critically and more effectively about designing adult learning. I've provided you with my email address, as well as if you're active on social media, my Twitter handle is there too. And I'm always happy to talk professional learning. It's a key part of the work that I do. So we're actually going to start with an opportunity for you to engage in a conversation. I'll just break you up into pairs for a quick chat. I'm going to show you two pictures. First of all, this link here goes to a great segment from a TEDx talk about designing effective adult learning. So that's something that you can check out a little later on, should you so choose. But these two images that you see on your screen, these were header images from two articles about professional learning and education, right? So these were the images that were at the top of those articles. And I've provided the links under the pictures too. And it says a lot, right, about our overall thinking when it comes to professional learning, right? So have those pictures in the back of your mind. Right? And I'm going to ask, let's see, what I'd like you to do, I'm going to, maybe rather than break you up here, I'm just going to open up the chat window. And I'm going to ask you just to share why you think these images might be images that reporters or journalists might choose as headings for articles about professional learning. So just feel free to write in the chat window why this might actually be a pretty common occurrence. Yeah, so Jen writes, maybe about or why we need to think about adding some energy, right, and engagement to our professional learning sessions. And we'll talk more about that after. Yeah, Donna wrote that in a lot of cases, the topic of the professional development is a mismatch for the people who were there, right? Hence the people who look disengaged, or maybe the person in the right image, like potentially asleep at the table. Right. Other thoughts? Yeah, right. So Debbie writes like, yeah, clearly they're not interested in what's going on, And I think yes to all of those, right? And so this idea that there's this perceived view that professional learning is not of high interest for the people who are participating in it, right? And so let's take a quick look at why that might be a common occurrence. right? So one thing that we know is that professional development, the process of adult learning, how it's provided, hasn't changed a significant um, amount over the last few decades. You know, workshops still look very similar to how they have in the past. There's still a general structure that continues to exist. The methods that we use to facilitate don't match what the audience needs. But I think this gets back to elements of what Donna was talking about too. Same with that next bullet, right? The wrong audience at the wrong time. And then a lot of times too, we've all experienced the idea of lack of planning for professional learning, right? Sometimes there is a superintendent's conference day coming up. Professional learning hasn't been front and center in our thinking, and so we don't plan effectively well for it. Our facilitation could be poor, and sometimes there's no follow-up. We don't really provide continuity from one professional learning session to the next. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about this dichotomy. And so what I'm going to do is break you up into groups, okay? And we'll just form into groups of two. And I want you to think about really three questions. Okay, first, over the course of the last year, what was the best professional learning experience you've engaged in? Okay. And then what was the worst example? So think of those two ends of the spectrum. When was there a really great learning opportunity for you? When wasn't there? And then what would need to happen to move what was really bad for you to what was really engaging? And we're going to take really just about 4 minutes, give each person in the pair about 2 minutes to just share that out. A great experience, a not good experience, and what would need to happen to move the bad to the good. And then you'll just change roles. And then we'll come back together after having kind of set that stage. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'm going to break you up into breakout rooms. Okay, and I'm going to send you on your way. So you should have an option to join a breakout room. Okay, if you'll pop in and chat with your colleague, and we'll come back together in a few minutes. I can't help you now. I'm working. No, I can't. Sorry, baby. I can't. So welcome back as you're coming back from your breakout rooms. And if you're just joining our session, we had taken a brief break to talk about some great professional learning experiences and some really bad ones as well. We should have everybody coming back very shortly. Well, welcome back, everyone. So I'm going to I'm going to share my screen again. And so what I'd ask anyone to do, if you're interested, feel free to unmute and share in a sentence or two what you felt would need to happen to move your poor professional learning experience into a good one. So that third question.
I think planning is key. And I think my poor professional experience deals with my weekly special ed meetings I have to attend, and they're led by two people, and they don't seem to be synchronized. So there's a lot of, did I get everything? What did I forget? Going on back to them, and it's like watching table tennis.
Yeah, that's true, right? We can always really tell if planning has happened or it hasn't. Other thoughts? Thanks, Jen.
One of the things that we discussed was immediate relevancy. I can take it back and apply it to whatever it is I'm going to be doing or interacting with my students in a particular way that helps me do my job better.
Thank you, Donna. Another thought?
I think the fear they have of learning how to communicate with each other, to interact because of the situation that's happening.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. It's very true, right? So those are all really important elements, right? And so what we know, so here's what we know. This is what the research really says about professional development that really leads to learning. And there's a lot more we can dive into regarding how adults learn, right? The actual study of learning for adults is a really big topic, right? So, but I'm going to provide you with kind of these 7 bullet points that if professional learning, if learning for adults meets each of these, if you can check a box for these, then you'll be really helping people engage in learning. And none of this is real rocket science, right? It makes perfect sense. And yet it's probably not surprising to you how many of the professional learning opportunities we engage in don't check all these boxes, right? So I want you to take a look at these 7, and I want you to think about areas that tend to happen for you as a learner, right? How many of the professional learning sessions that you've attended have been truly personalized for you? How many are engaging and keep you really kind of involved in the experience itself? How many build in accountability? And accountability isn't a bad word. It's just it has to be really done well and make sense for people, right? And how many are tied to your role? I mean, we've probably all been involved in professional learning experiences where we ask ourselves, why are we here? Right? Why was this designed specifically for us? Right? So the thing is, if we can, for those of you who know me, I'm a bit of a science, sci-fi, comics type of geek, right? So I think of these as like the Justice League of professional development. If we check these 7 boxes, then we've already accomplished some of the hardest work of designing learning that will land well for adults. And by the way, these 7 also apply to learning for our youngest students, right? If we also check these boxes, then we're more likely to really help all of our students learn. And so one of the things that's really kind of interesting, so Malcolm Gladwell has written a number of books that really take a look at some of the ways in which we as a species, human beings, kind of engage in things, right? A tipping point back in 2000 was a really important text by exploring this idea of stickiness, right? And stickiness, right? Like what lets an idea stick with us, what makes us really internalize learning. It's a really important concept. And the idea is whatever we're experiencing so memorable that it causes us to take action. And I would contend that learning doesn't happen if we don't shift a practice because of it, right? Learning can't be passive. Something has to change for all of us in order for something to be learned. And this idea of stickiness is really tied to that, right? It's so impactful that you end up changing some part of your being, some part of who you are. And so that's where we can really make a difference with our professional learning. If we can check those 7 boxes, we're more likely to make learning stick for people. That idea of transfer, right? Helping people actually take an idea and take action on it. Now, one of the things I learned is that the only way I can help people check those boxes is if I recognize that professional learning is more about the actual facilitation. It's more about just the workshop. And we have to incorporate what comes before it and what comes after it, right? If you think of like a sandwich cookie, right? You've got the 2 cookies and then like something in the middle. What we often see is just what's in the middle, the facilitation, right? The workshop, the institute, whatever we find ourselves at. But if we're going to do it right, we have to pay attention to both ends of it too, right? We have to put adequate time into the planning. And then after that professional learning experience is over, we have to do appropriate amounts of follow-up. And so I want to talk with you a little bit about each of these 3 phases, okay? And I'll make this available, the presentation available. And from my own experiences, both research I've done for writing that I've engaged in, and then also work I've done with districts throughout the New York City suburbs, here's kind of some of what I've learned, right? First of all, that planning phase is often the phase we ignore the most. We tend to devote too short an amount of time into planning professional learning and too much into actually providing it. And one of the things that happens when we shortchange planning is we miss out on some really important elements. One thing that we miss out on is we don't provide the purpose and the rationale for why we're engaged in the work. If you've ever been to a workshop and asked yourself why you're there, then clearly what's been missed is that purpose, that focus. The other thing that we miss is if we don't plan well, we never incorporate the voice of the people who we should be asking about this. So to give you an example, BOCES runs a number of collegial circle groups. They're opportunities for educators to get together in role-alike groups, right? So if you are a leader of a math department, it's an opportunity for you to come together with other leaders of math departments. And we're always looking to determine ways to continue to build on a service like that. And so just this morning, in fact, we met with some of the leaders of our collegial circle groups to ask them about an idea that we had about extending some of the supports to role-alike groups. Now, we could have looked to simply roll this idea out, but it was important to us that we incorporated the voice of the people who we know we want to play a role in how this develops. Another key thing that can sometimes be missing from planning, right, if we ignore the planning phase, is that the design of the workshop itself doesn't really meet the function we need it to. And so, for instance, if you've ever sat in on a professional development session that's purely lecture-based, right, and sometimes said to yourself, why couldn't this just be shared out, right? Why couldn't this be emailed? We could do something different together. That's a case where the lack of planning likely led to a workshop taking that form. right? And it also prevents us from really thinking about the data we want to collect. And so I think one of the biggest lessons to take from our time together today is that we have to do a better job overall at planning the professional learning we have, which means we need to give ourselves more time to think through the professional learning. In terms of facilitation and providing, that's the aspect of professional learning design we tend to do best. It's what we tend to spend the most time on, and generally it's the most developed of our work. And the key is for us to remember when we are facilitating professional learning is that we have to recognize who the people are who are with us and what we can do in the space that we're in. So for instance, in Zoom, doing virtual work, there are some things that we have to do differently than if we were face to face in a conference center or a workshop space. Facilitators also have to take the time to be participants. You know, you can't always be the sage on the stage, right? When you're leading any type of adult learning, it's important for whoever's leading that learning to turn the reins over to the participants who are in the session, whether it's engaging in conversation, breakout groups, whatever it might be. But the facilitator has to take enough time to really gauge where people are. And we also have to remember that even during a professional development session, the facilitator needs to make sure that they're collecting data. Sometimes that can be just visually, what are people doing, either in the conference center, on the Zoom call, etc. It can be the types of questions that people are asking. It can be conversations that are happening in breakout groups, but that facilitator will always be at his or her best if that person is always collecting information from the participants in the room. And then lastly is the following up phase. And so in order to make sure that professional learning really does stick for people, we have to analyze what people took from it. That involves things like feedback surveys. It can involve direct reach out, calling participants and seeing what they took from it. And then also making sure that whatever practices you've embedded into designing this workshop or this session is something that you're going to systematize. It's something that's going to continue throughout your work, because the design that you incorporate for one session should mirror the overall structures you put in place in the other. The format of the professional learning may look very different, but the design structure you use should be the same. And so I'm going to ask you to regroup, okay? And I'm going to break you back up into small groups, and I should share this with you. So let me see if I can find a good way to do this. I can. All right, I'm going to pop this into the chat window. And this is really just a design checklist I put together, and I'll share it out so you'll have it. But these are basically some of the questions I ask myself as I'm putting together a workshop or an institute or conference, okay? And these questions really kind of go across those three phases. And so some of them may be valuable to you. Some of them may be helpful. They're questions that you can ask just to help yourself kind of stay on track with one model that you can use for professional learning design. But I'm going to share this out. Let me do that. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm going to grab the sharing link. I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to pop it into the chat box. So there's the link. And here you go. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you don't mind opening it up on your screen, so you have those questions. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is break you back up into breakout groups. Let me share my screen again. I'm just going to run back to this. Perfect. And I want you to think back to the professional development session that wasn't impactful. You know, the one where you felt, yeah, this was not great for me. I want you to take a look at that checklist and discuss with your partner some of the changes that you would make. You know, if you were designing that session, you know, what, based on those questions, what would be something you have done differently, or a few things, right? And then let your partner know the number one change you would make to make that professional learning session more impactful, stickier, you know, having a greater influence on you and other people who participated. Right, so we're going to look at those questions. We're going to go back and now think of the professional learning session that wasn't really powerful for us. And we're going to talk about some of the changes we would make and just let our partner know the one biggest change we think we would make. You know, that one key question that we might have asked whoever was designing that professional learning to think a little bit about. So I'm going to group you back up. Let me stop sharing. Okay. And I think if I've done this right, you should actually be with the same people. So let me do that. So I'm going to open the rooms and send you an invite, and then it should work. And Janelle, I think I'm just going to look to see a room, if there's a room that doesn't have two people, and then I'll assign you to that one. Because I think you came in when.
I came in right after
Perfect.
they did theirs.
So let me just say, we have a couple more people who are here. Let's see. They've got two. Okay, I'm going to send you to a breakout room now. And so now you should have an invite.
Yep.
Okay, great. And that'll send you there.
Here, man. Done.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Oh, you done? You good?
All good.
Hi. Okay, he left me. Okay.
How's it going? You doing okay?
We're doing okay. We're actually talking about Well, I guess it was a meeting we went to at BOCES for PBIS. Both him and I are new. We work together. I'm the school guidance counselor. He's a psychologist, and we're like
Sure.
we've been thrown into the PBIS system, and like this year, like we've both been like trying to learn it and go actually with everything that they told us, like previous people that were in the committee, we were all confused. But actually, when we went to BOCES, they were very helpful.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear
Dr.
that.
Langley, is it? I think she heads those.
Yes, yes, yep.
Yeah, she was
Oh, awesome. Good. That's great. Good to
yeah.
hear. Well, I'm just popping around from room to room, so I'll leave you
Okay.
to it and we'll call everybody back in a minute.
Sounds good.
See you in
Okay.
a bit.
Okay.
So welcome back, everyone. And I'm just going to pop the, I'm giving you the link to the presentation too, just so I can get that to you now. So let me just do that. Just popping it into the chat. So I'd be curious to hear from you before I just share one more bit to consider. So what might have been a priority? You know, either a key question that you wish whoever was designing this meeting, whether it be a colleague, whether it was even yourself, you know, a question that you would have asked were you to redesign it again. What would have been something that you would have wished somebody would have focused on in the design of the session that you thought of? So feel free to unmute and just chime in.
I think the communication between the parent and the kid and the teacher is really lacked because the kids not taking it serious because they don't get up till about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And where do you stand when you're trying to explain to them what you're trying to do for them? They don't want to hear it. I think they're getting more bored than anything just to listen to what you have to say to them.
Yeah, and how
Tuning out, they tune us out.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and how at a time where we're all experiencing so many challenges, right? How do we make sure that everybody feels supported too? And I think part of that is how we kind of listen to concerns and how we provide those elements of support, right? So one of the things I often think about is,
But then where's the support towards the adults that's doing this every day for the kids?
yeah,
We support our kids, but is there enough support for the adults that's doing this every day? And you get knocked in the face every day because of the communication you have to have with the kids and the parents.
such a good point. It really is. It's so hard. And I hope that, for everyone who we're working with, right? Whether we're in a school, whether we're in a BOCES, whether we're working with a residential center, um, that we have the opportunity to share our voice, to express kind of what we're experiencing, because that's such an important part of the learning process, right? If we need to make sure that, to your point, we're not just the ones who are providing support, but the support is there for us too. And I think when you think about what you need to learn, that's a key part of it. You have to feel that you have a way to express your voice and that your voice is going to be taken into account in designing whatever learning experiences exist for you, right? I mean, if we're doing it for our students, we hope that it's also done for us too. And so that's a really important part of the work. One thing I'll share for me, um, one of the things that I don't always do the best job of is giving myself the time I need to really reflect on how things have gone. Sometimes what can end up happening is I move quicker than I should. And what ends up happening is I don't take the time to really think ideas through. So some of the questions I like to ask myself are really, have I given myself enough time to consider this? Have I asked enough people for feedback? And sometimes too, it's as easy as just forcing myself to sleep on an idea, right? To give myself enough time so that I can circle back. And if I still feel the same way the next way, then maybe my design is really appropriate. But a lot of times I come up with new questions to ask and new things to wonder about. And that doesn't mean that we allow ourselves to kind of get into this position where it's like paralysis by analysis, right? We spend so much time thinking about something that we don't take action. I wouldn't suggest that, but there has to be a balance, because one of the things that can sometimes happen if we act too fast is that we don't give planning or the following up, the data analysis, the time it needs to really impact our work. So I recognize that we only have 15 minutes left. And so what I'm going to do, I want to share my screen one more time and talk a little bit about something I found to be really helpful for me. And this will just be a kind of quick share out before we wrap up our session. So we've talked a little bit about our own personal experiences, what's worked and what hasn't. We looked at some of what the research said. I shared a little bit of a frame that's been helpful for me to think about professional learning as being very similar to like a sandwich cookie, having planning and following up as important components and not just the actual providing, not just the workshop or the institute itself. And so one of the things that I struggled with, even when I came up a little bit with this kind of idea of how to think of it as a three-pillared approach, was forcing myself to dive into each of those phases, right? Because it's one thing to know that we have to incorporate planning and we have to give time at the end to follow up on professional learning. It's another thing to actually do it, right? I think there's a lot that we recognize about the education profession. And at the same time, even though we know things are good ideas, because of the nature of our profession and the timeline and how things work, we don't always practice what we preach, right? And that's not for any reason other than the fact that sometimes we're time bound, we don't have the time to make things work, or we don't get all the support we need, right? So one of the things I wanted to do was say, how do I make sure I actually dive into these 3 phases? So I came up with an organizing principle that I call the TAR method, right? TAR is sticky, right? So this kind of process to think about making learning that sticks to go along with this method made a lot of sense for me. And what I did was I just created a simple kind of visual for me to dive into each of the 3 phases, the planning, the providing, and the following up, and to force myself to think about it, right? To outline the steps that I took as I thought about that phase, action steps, things I would take to actually do it, and then forced reflection time to make sure I review. And what I came up with is a diagram, and I'll happily share this in the chat as well, that kind of looks like this. It's a simple organizational framework, right, for me to break down steps that forced me to go through these phases, right? So that initial phase, and I left the phases blank because honestly, you could use this for any multi-step process that you have in your life. Personally, professionally, our students can use this, right? So if you have, if you think of like baking a cake, gathering the ingredients, baking it, and serving it, right? And I know we're taking a really, we're using kind of a general process to think about this, but within each component of those phases, there are things you need to think about, there are actions you need to take, and then before you go to the next phase, there's things that you want to review. And so I found this design to be really useful to me to force myself to not ignore one of the 3 phases, because I made it so I wouldn't go further. I wouldn't move beyond a given phase until I had actually taken time to think, act, and review elements of that phase. And so what this allowed me to do was operationalize a model that I thought would have some validity. And it's been a great way to keep me focused on planning, providing, and following up on professional learning. It's not the only model. It's not the only type of framework, but for me, it worked because it forced me to think about what I wanted to do, lay out the steps I was going to take, and then take the time to actually review whether the outcomes I got, right, whether the planning I did actually worked or not. And so I share that with you because one of the things that I've taken from designing professional learning over these last 10 years, that it's as much about the focused and really kind of planned steps as it is the actual topic or idea itself. Like any good design experience, the end result, the outcome, is only going to be as good as the design itself, right? Even the most attractive cars, for instance, are only going to be great vehicles if they drive well, right? If the design and the build for them is really well done. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to share that image in the chat as well. And then I'll open it up to any questions or thoughts that you have. So let me see if I can just do this real quick. I just want to get that image up if I can. So, and if you've got a question while I'm searching for an organizational framework just to share, feel free to unmute, share a wondering that this session made you think about, maybe a question you have about designing professional learning in general, or any kind of comments or questions. This is kind of the world I live in, so I'm happy to chat about it with you.
Fred, follow-up is, in your mind, a reflection of how the session went and whether people were engaged and so on? Or is, or is follow-up looking at how people are actually utilizing or able to use that in their classroom, in their whatever it is they're doing, why they chose to be there? Because I struggle with the latter, not the former.
Yes, it's Donna. I think it's actually both. I think we do the former quite well, actually, generally. I think we're very good at collecting what Guskey would call level 1 and 2 feedback. You know, Tom Guskey, great thinker on professional learning. He wrote Evaluating Professional Development, which is like one of the foundational texts, and I'll put the link in here, Evaluating Professional Development by Tom Guskey. It's one of the kind of foundational texts that talk about how do we determine whether a professional and adult learning session went well. And so he talks about 5 levels of follow-up for professional learning. Most of us do great jobs with that level 1 and 2 data. Those are the, how do you think the session went? What did you find useful? What didn't you find useful? And then all the things about like the logistics of the session too. Was the food good? How was the temperature? Were you comfortable? And all of those things are important follow-up considerations. What we don't do as well is the level 3, 4, and 5 data collection, which starts to involve impact. Okay, and Donna, what you were talking about was determining the impact that professional learning has on people beyond the session itself. Those are the actions that an educator will take to put into practice with the students they work with or the other adults they work with. And to get an impact, a couple things have to happen. One, you have to do more than send surveys, right? You're either going to be calling people to chatting with them, you're going to do classroom or school visitations. You have to be able to see change. The other thing that you have to be willing to do is give it time. And so what that means is that you might not check in for 3 or 4 months, and you're going to then ask a random sampling of people what they've actually used from this session. Now, you can do that with surveys, but a lot of times it's better to do it face-to-face or via a phone call. And because of that, it takes time, right? And so you can imagine if you're an assistant superintendent or a building principal, you can send out surveys on superintendent's conference days and get some general information. But if you really want to understand whether people have used any of this beyond that day or that afternoon, then you've got to be willing to embed the time to actually talk with people about it, and look at what's changed and what's happening. So I think that following up involves both of those very different methods, collecting and using data. And I'd say, to go back to your initial comment, we all tend to do the former much better than the latter. The latter is much harder to do.
Thank you.
Sure. Other thoughts, wonderings, questions, things that are on your mind before we wrap up? So I want to thank you, everybody, for coming to join us this afternoon. In the chat window, I've put both the presentation link. I've also put those questions, and then the TAR organizational framework. And what I'm going to share with you too before you go, I want to send, I'm going to put the link for our professional learning on the go sessions for the rest of this week. And of course, we hope that you're able to take advantage. All right, there's that link there. And then two, feel free to share any feedback. I'm going to give you a feedback link for thoughts on any of the sessions you've attended, things that you might want to see offered, and then just general thoughts about what some of your needs are, as we continue to work through a very different time indeed. So I wish you a great afternoon. I want to thank you for joining me, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, same to you.